Hello, everyone, and welcome to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. I'm with us today is Representative Sean Casten from the state of Illinois. And Sean is a leader on climate issues and clean energy issues, both in Congress and work he did before he went to Congress. A quick heads up, we'll be recording this webinar, streaming it live on Facebook, so we can share it with people who aren't able to join with us today. Sean Casten is the congressperson from Illinois' 6th Congressional District. He serves on the House Financial Services Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. He also serves as the vice chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition in Congress. Before becoming congressperson, as I mentioned, Sean Casten spent his career driving climate solutions in the clean energy sector and in renewable energy. He's here to debrief us this morning on his take on the President's State of the Union speech. We'll have a bit of discussion of what's the overall themes of the speech, and then particularly, what did the President say? What's the President going to do? How do things look like they're going to move in Congress on climate and clean energy? We'll have a bit of discussion, open it up to Q&A for your questions. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A icon and we'll do our best to try to address them. So Representative Casten, thank you for joining us today. Many of us watched the State of the Union speech on TV. Give us your overall impression on it before we get into the nitty-gritty on climate change.
Well, thanks for having me, Howard. Always a pleasure to be here. So at first, say what we're not really supposed to say. Most State of the Unions are really boring. You're not supposed to say that.
Yes, they are.
And yes, when you're there, there's the pageantry, and obviously, just tremendous awe that you get to be there. But there's a lot of standing and sitting and clapping, and and all that goes with that. And so I would say that as members of Congress, not to sound jaded, but you walk into these things with expectations, a little mediocre, and it's a chance to, elevate some issues, obviously the guests you bring and get the national spotlight a little bit. And I think to a person, we were really, really blown away. Not to be pejorative, but I have a good friend of mine who was masterful at talking his way out of assignments in college, and his line when he'd get back from, convincing some professor to let him hand in a paper a month late. So I said, how'd the conversation go? And he said, I played her like a fine violin. And the President played that room like a fine violin. I mean, that for those of us watching, that tee up on, Social Security and Medicare are not going to get cut, and the booing, and then, riffing from that to say, okay, we've got that locked down. I don't know if you all realize what a big deal that is, but that just politically boxed out the Republicans from coming back on Social Security and Medicare in just a masterful way. And 30 seconds up there, like that one little bit changed the politics. Had he doubled down at that point and said, I hear some of you are going to come after the defense budget as well, he could have kept it going. So that was really good. The second thing was he was very clearly and justifiably proud of what has happened in the last 2 years, right? I mean, remember 2 years ago, we had an insurrection, we had a collapsing economy, we had body bags in Central Park, right? And to be able to say we're now at record low unemployment, that the economy is growing again, and that we're investing in all this infrastructure, and that a lot of that was done on a bipartisan basis, but what wasn't done on a bipartisan basis is actually still really popular. I think was sort of there from a position of strength, and obviously, from a climate perspective, I'll leave it to you all who follow this more closely. I'm pretty sure that was more discussion of climate in a State of the Union than any State of the Union I recall listening to. It was certainly the first time there has ever been a State of the Union where the President said, we just signed the biggest climate bill in the history of not only of America, but of the world, and we are moving into implementation phase, and let's finish the job. Like, that's never happened before, right? I mean, normally it was a big deal if we could get even the President to acknowledge climate change in a speech. So, so I think that's a big deal. And now we've got to move forward, as the President said, to finish the job.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. The President said the climate crisis doesn't care if your state's a red state or a blue state, sort of riffing off President Obama's famous line. The president called this an existential threat. We have an obligation to our children and our grandchildren to confront it and finish the job. I think he said finish the job about half a dozen times during his speech. So let's start with the Inflation Reduction Act. What does it take for this administration? What does it take for Congress to implement it, to finish the job? What's next? What do you think is most important?
Well, look, let's start by stating the obvious. The Republican Congress under Speaker McCarthy is not going to do much on climate. It was nice of you to read my committees at the start. What you didn't mention at the start is that I used to be on the select committee on the climate crisis. I was not booted off that committee. The committee was eliminated. And so
I thought I was going to be graceful with that one.
So, and it's funny, not funny, right?
Yes.
So I think we're going to be in an implementation phase. I think there is an understandable concern of, will the new majority be trying to frustrate that implementation process? I think the good thing on the IRA is that of that $380 billion that we put in there to climate, the vast majority of that is in the form of tax credits. And it's much harder for an unfriendly House and unfriendly future administration to undo a tax credit than to undo or frustrate the implementation of a program. And so I think for you, Howard, for a lot of people listening in, we all now have agency in implementing the IRA by, ourselves as individuals, our employers, the companies we may run, like whatever our sources of agency is, get that capital in and grab those tax credits, because now we've got these incentives to go there and bring it forward. So we've all got some agency now going forward. The big, I think, concerns we have around implementation that I think are shared by, certainly those of us in the House and the White House, are really twofold. Number one is that we're sitting here right now in a world with 3.5% unemployment. And we've got Buy America provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got Buy American provisions in the CHIPS and Science Act. The infrastructure bill, by definition, is domestic investment. And we're very close to full employment. This is a good problem to have. But the types of things that we need to do to grow the labor force are kind of partisan, right? I mean, immigration reform, figuring out how to historically underemployed groups get job training. Those are going to be tough. So I think the White House is going to be pushing a lot where they can through executive actions, things around job training, things to, maybe address worker mobility. But I think it's on all of us to try to figure out how to solve that so that we've just got the bodies. And then the second piece is, you and I have talked a lot about this, Howard. We are moving where the generation is, because that's the nature of renewable energy. You don't run the pipeline to where the load is. You put the power plant where the resource is, and we're moving where the loads are. Because whether it's electric vehicle charging or, dare I say, replacing your gas oven with an electric oven, a lot of that electrification is putting loads in places that don't have those loads right now. And there is a permitting challenge with doing that. I don't think there's going to be a lot of legislative progress in permitting, but I do think it's really important. And my friends in the White House understand this, that getting FERC to be fully staffed, there's so many of the things around using the grid we have as efficiently as we can use it that are around market structure, interregional coordination, dynamic load rating, the ancillary services markets. They're all things that are FERC jurisdictional, but we really need FERC to be fully staffed. And so some of those issues around appointments within executive branch agencies to move forward are going to be really critical.
I completely agree with you on the appointments, and FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for those of you who aren't steeped in, energy law and energy policy, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, needs more staff to do its job well. It needs to have a full contingent of commissioners to do its job well. Talk a little bit, if you would, Congressman, about the importance of investment tax credits. Those are carrots. How about the sticks that the federal government can use? We still have a lot of old coal plants running in the Midwest. It's awfully hard to decarbonize if Mid-American Energy is running 5 coal plants in Iowa until 2050. North Dakota, they continue to run lignite coal plants. Southern Illinois, the Prairie State plant. How do we move to decarbonize? Can we do that only with carrots, or does the US EPA and the federal government have to use some sticks as well?
Well, look, in a dream world, every carrot is balanced by an equivalent stick, right? You should get the same reward for doing the right thing as you get penalized for doing, the inverse of the right thing. We're never in an ideal world, but yes, I would expect we'll see. We've got a bunch of EPA regulations that are overdue now, that are coming forward. Maybe, might we have a power plant CO2 rule? I think everybody's a little bit skittish in the wake of the West Virginia versus EPA decision and this, bizarro, theory that, well, I'll leave you lawyers to go into that, but this potentially upending some of the Chevron decisions. So those sticks will come out there from the agencies. There's, depending on your view, this is either a stick or a carrot. We are about to see the SEC's climate disclosure rule come out. And these are disclosure rules that Chair Gensler and the SEC have been working on. The public comment period's over. We should expect to see those rules any day about what companies have to disclose at what level of detail about their contribution to global warming and their risk exposure to a warming world. And there's been a lot of back and forth on that, but that's going to be really important because we've seen, there's what, $18 trillion of assets under management in ESG funds right now. That's a lot of money, right? And that's money that wants to have metrics to evaluate on. And I think, the movement we've already seen away from dirty energy towards clean energy, and certainly in the price earnings ratio, clean energy is killing it relative to the fossil sector. I think that accelerates once that comes out. The last thing that I'd mention, and because you mentioned, local coal plants, as you would know, Howard, and as I think some people may not, many of the coal plants that are on the grid today, if they shut down tomorrow, would lower the price of power because they're not participating directly in wholesale markets. They're bidding above the clearing price, but they're locked in because of the way that they've been regulatorily structured. And whether that's because it's a vertically integrated utility that's got an obligation to, guarantee the returns on the capital, or like Prairie State, where it's just a very complicated and confusing bond offering. People would be better off economically and environmentally if those plants shut down. And there is a tool we put in the IRA that I would encourage everybody to avail themselves of, an expanded authority to the DOE's Loan Program Office. So the DOE's Loan Program Office now has the authority, thanks to what we put in the IRA. And by the way, this is above and beyond that $380 billion that I mentioned, because it doesn't score until you take the loan. It's a tool that can give money to, whether it's a state or a regulatory agency, or indeed even like make the math work, the coal plant operator, that says we will swap your long-term expectation of capital recovery for your plant with a longer-term note with the interest rate set on the equivalent treasury security. So you can securitize the non-amortized capital, shut that plant down, and then use the spread to go and generate cash flows to meet your future loads. It's modeled on some rules that have come out of places like Kansas that have taken measures to securitize out of the money coal plants. And it's a really good tool. I probably haven't spent enough time. I've probably already put half your audience to sleep with that answer, but really, really important. I think for those folks who care about cheap energy and care about clean energy, get on that wagon, because the LPO is sitting on something on the order, depending on what you think is going to be the risk profile, something in the neighborhood of $250 billion of lending authority that they can use to help bring those forward, and they need to deploy it quickly.
And this is a real advantage if you're serving on the House Financial Services Committee. I mean, most people, when they think about climate change and various committees, think about Senate Energy and Commerce Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, House Natural Resources Committee, both on the ESG issue you raised and on the Loan Program Office, the LPO. The House Finance Service Committee is a tremendous platform for you to be able to move some of those things forward. I mean, so kudos to your involvement there and what you've been doing on ESG. One of the other opportunities, by the way, of the coal plants shutting down or using loan program office funds to transition them, that frees up transmission. It also frees up sites that are locked into transmission, hardwired in for solar plus storage development. And one of the things I think you and I have talked about at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, we're working with utilities in Michigan to take some of these shut down coal plant sites and convert them into solar plus storage and parklands. Many of them sit right on the shores of the Great Lakes. Those are underutilized assets, both for clean energy generation, freeing up transmission. And if they're on the lake, because they all have to be on water, it's a parklands opportunity. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing with the, if you will, the ESG caucus you helped form, the working group?
Yeah, so this is a caucus that shouldn't have to exist, but it is here to play defense.
But it's good you're doing it.
Yeah, so we had myself and Juan Vargas from California, had introduced and passed on the last term the SEC Disclosure Act, which would require the SEC to mandate disclosures for corporations for a whole range of ESG issues. Congressman Vargas was on ESG writ broadly. Mine, the Climate Disclosure Act, was specific to climate. That bill was never taken up in the Senate. Don't get me started on how much the Senate loves their filibuster. But the SEC did act through rulemaking to basically do what we put in that bill. And so now you have the SEC doing this. Well, as I said in an event I was at this morning, the oldest truism in Washington is that losers will always cry louder than winners cheer. And so as we are moving to a world, some of the projections are that a third of all assets under management in the US will be in ESG funds within 5 to 7 years. That's a huge number. There are tons of people who are moving their capital around to try to address those issues. And depending on who you look at, there's a case to be made that that's actually giving them better long-term returns as well. The response to a over-subsidized energy industry that is now finding that they are struggling to compete in spite of their subsidies has not been to embrace capitalism. It has been to demand more subsidies. And so there's this pushback that's come, and we've seen this group, the State Financial Officers Foundation, that is now pushing multiple laws that have successfully moved forward in places like West Virginia, Indiana, Texas, that would mandate state treasurers not be allowed to deploy pension funds in any fund that has an ESG mandate. This is costing folks a lot of money. The analysis in Indiana that you may have seen, Howard, that was just done is that this is going to cost pension fund beneficiaries in Indiana something like 100% returns compounded annually, because they're basically picking worse funds and they're losing some competitive pricing in their market. So what we've done with this ESG caucus is to counter that. And as I said in our hearing yesterday, my colleague, and I do say this genuinely, my friend Andy Barr from Kentucky has been leading the push against ESG. And so I made the point yesterday that last week we voted on the floor of the House to denounce socialism in all its forms. And I said it's important for us to denounce socialism even when it comes out of the mouths of our friends like Mr. Barr, who is suggesting that capital markets should not be free to freely allocate capital. I mean, that's kind of capitalism 101. And so in the name of making sure that markets work, in the names of looking out for the interests of pension holders, and yes, in the name of the climate, we have created an ESG caucus to counter some of the silliness.
Well, good. There are a couple of questions. I've been just following the Q&A in the chat about the IRA implementation. Ann McKibben is asking if you can comment on how does the IRA implementation mesh with the executive branch's Justice 40 goals. Art Smith is asking about how can it be used to make the distribution grid at the local level more amenable to community solar. Stephanie Blanco is asking about, what do you think of the enormous subsidies in the IRA for old nuclear plants and so forth? Can you talk a little bit about how that plays out in the IRA implementation and what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, I can try. I mean, I think a lot of those things is really where we all have agency in the answers to this. I mean, to take the distribution piece question as the start, a lot of those are state level laws, right? And yes, the IRA, I think, is going to move the way that capital is being deployed, but we're going to have to address these things also on a local level. One place that I would encourage people really to get involved, this is not the IRA, but is related to it. We did just pass this infrastructure bill as well. That infrastructure bill is sending a ton of money to the states. Some is programmatic, some is some is going to have applications that you can go through. But if you're in Illinois, if you're in Indiana, if you're in any state, your state agency is now deploying funds, whether it's IDOT in Illinois or someone like that, that are informed by some of these Justice 40 type initiatives, but are going to be interpreted at the state level in some cases. And so I think it's going to be important, as folks are out there, let's get projects submitted. Let's work with the state agencies to try to make sure that those meet those goals. And, and the ones that are coming directly through the federal government, I think that's a little easier in a friendly administration. If you're in a state like Indiana, you may want to be, a little more closely involved in making sure that gets deployed in a prudent fashion. I'm forgetting there were a bunch of other questions that were in there.
About the subsidies for nuclear power, about how do you make IRA work with the Justice 40 goals?
Yeah, so a lot of the Justice 40 goals, I would say, will be more on executive branch implementation. And again, because a lot of the IRA was really more about tax credits for businesses, but it's obviously important to the White House and they'll keep pushing it. With respect to nuclear, and these are sort of related issues, there was I never want to say that a bill that we passed and voted on and that I'm proud of was anything less than perfect. But sometimes,
of course,
yes,
of course.
I can't speak for you, Howard. Sometimes
legislation is like sausage making. we know and we understand. If you saw what went into it, you'd probably never have one.
I think all of us would probably acknowledge that in some idealistic world, we provide equivalent federal incentives for equivalent outcomes. In the world we live in, there are a whole host of existing incentives for various technologies, and it's hard to undo that writ large. And so what we had in the IRA, well, prior to the IRA, was production tax credits of a certain level for wind, production tax credits of a different level for other technologies, investment tax credits for solar, investment tax credits of a different level for geothermal, cogeneration, et cetera, et cetera. And so while in an ideal world, everything would scale to some normal number, what we did is said, let's roll this out. It's 10 years of certainty, but the Department of Energy, and I may have the year wrong, so don't quote me exactly on this, but it's somewhere in like the 2025 timeframe, is affirmatively obligated to convert those tax credits to a technology neutral perspective. We didn't go into a lot of detail about exactly how to do that, because if we did that, it probably would have picked a lot of political fights between different people who are trying to figure out whether they're going to win or lose by that transition. But there's going to be a really important DOE rulemaking that comes out. And in my view, and this relates to the nuclear piece, that should really, I think, harmonize to what is your overall impact per unit of CO2 reduction. And so I'm not saying that's how it'll happen. I'm not saying there's anything prescriptive in the law, but I think for those of us like myself who have a hard time seeing how we get a fully decarbonized society without some component of baseload zero carbon power, we need to make sure that we find a way to bring that nuclear has a role there going forward. In the short term, that's going to be about, how do we, safely continue to operate and re-permit where we can the existing fleet. In the longer term, it's going to be a question about how do we bring next generation technologies forward. Whether that's SMR or, if you want to go, futuristic, do we think fusion's going to get there? I don't know, but I think we would all agree that none of those technologies are going to go forward right now purely on private sector, assuming all the risk. And so there are
the
some
numbers don't work. The solar plus storage outcompetes it every day, every night.
Yeah, and yet we still have to find some way to get through. So it's we're I think it's the appropriate policy tool to say that we are going to transition to a tax policy that rewards goals and doesn't specify paths, but that we're not there yet. And there will be an interesting process over the next few years through rulemakings to implement what the IRA says to do at the Department of Energy to figure out how to get there.
Congressman, a quick question that Rob Hogue is asking in the Q&A and others have asked. Is there any hope of being able to work with some of the Republicans in the House on the climate crisis? Or is that just, in today's political environment, fanciful?
Well, I think it depends very much on the issue. I think if you, I guess I'd frame it as saying there's three things that you have to do on climate. You have to protect folks from the effects of climate change. You have to invest in R&D to make sure that we have the technologies in place to avert the causes of climate change. And you have to deploy those technologies that are ready for prime time in reducing the causes of climate change. I list them in that order because that's the increasing degree of difficulty for bipartisanship. I don't care what the letter is hanging off your name. If you have a community that's at risk of coastal flooding, you would like to have federal money to invest in levees. If you have a community that's at risk of wildfires, you would like to have money to invest in fire protection and suppression. So mitigating the effects of climate change is pretty bipartisan.
Well, when it comes to the Great Lakes, of course, where we live, we work, and we play, it's not even bipartisan, it's nonpartisan in support of protecting and restoring the Great Lakes. And while some of the Republicans prefer to call it coastal resilience, and some Republicans and most Democrats call it the impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes, for crying out loud, both sides of the aisle have been supportive on Great Lakes restoration. And when President Trump went to cut the budget, Governor Scott Walker and Governor Rick Snyder, Republican governors, said, "What are you doing?" So there may be some hope there.
I guess I'd frame that saying like it's in everybody's political interest to keep their backyard clean, right? And so
that's really nicely put.
The R&D piece tends to be pretty bipartisan. Where you have Republican, a little bit more, I'd say, on the Republican side of the aisle of any federal spending is bad. That can be hard for R&D, but I think broadly speaking, R&D and the Science Committee is a refreshingly nonpartisan committee for the most part, and that's pretty good. What gets harder is on the deployment of technologies to reduce CO2, because anytime we don't, and this is the reason why we didn't get a single Republican vote on the IRA. The IRA is fundamentally a deployment bill. And if my colleagues across the aisle felt the technologies we were deploying were uneconomic, they wouldn't have had any issue with it because those technologies wouldn't have been displacing the uneconomic technologies that are currently out there. But once you put a solar panel on your roof, you don't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh, I got to shut the solar panel off. The power price is too low today for me to justify operation." Right? And so that deployment is not so much Republican Democratic divide, but you can think about any deployment of zero carbon technology as a massive wealth transfer from energy producers to energy consumers. And so those folks who represent communities that depend on digging stuff out of the ground are reluctant for, I think, understandable reasons, right? I mean, if you represent coastal Louisiana, you can on the one hand say, "I need some levees," and on the other hand say, if the oil and gas industry goes away, I got a lot of unemployment. And so I think that tension tends to skew Republican Democratic because of the skew of how our politics has segmented geographically. But it's really, but the specific opportunities for bipartisanship end up being very localized. So, so for example, and I'm not making any promises on his behalf, but Randy Feenstra from Iowa has a ton of wind in his district. He would very much like to find ways to get that low-cost wind power into PJM markets in the Chicago area that pay a lot more than power markets in Iowa, and would like to find some way to sort of facilitate that deployment. And so Randy and I are able to work pretty constructively on saying, okay, how do we make sure that the clean energy has access to markets that don't have as much access to clean energy? And that's very locally relevant to him as a member of Congress, because he's representing an area that's not full of coal mining, it's full of wind mining right now. Right. So that's pretty
Well,
constructive.
it's a little more complicated in Iowa because Mid-American wants to both export wind power and keep running 5 coal plants, which doesn't help us move to decarbonization. I mean, there's a little context here too, which you know and understand.
There is, you play the bipartisanship, not because it's not that Congressman Feenstra supports that because he's a Republican or is biting his party. He's looking out for the interests of his district.
Absolutely.
Right? And, when we saw, by the way, in the IRA, one of the things we said is we want to prioritize, and this goes toward the Justice 40, we want to prioritize those investments in the areas that are going to be left behind in this transition. And it should not be lost on anyone that first big solar plant announcement was in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. Once you create winners, they have a way of insisting on preservation of the status quo. Right?
Well put. Congressman, let's shift to transportation, just because, as we both know, the transportation sector now is responsible for more carbon pollution than the energy sector, which reflects progress on the energy sector side for all the reasons you've been talking about. How do you see tremendous federal investment in building out an EV charging system on highways in the states around the country? It's chicken and egg. If you don't have a good EV charging system, people are less incentivized to buy electric vehicles, and fleets are less likely to get in there. Trucks, EV school buses, city buses, you need to have the charging system. How do you see that rolling out? How do you think that works in your district, in Illinois, around the Midwest? I know you've done a lot of thinking about it, but play out how you see this happening.
Yeah, so a couple of things. Like the first is, I think for context, it's important to note that EVs are here and growing for reasons that have to do with market pull. I say this as an EV owner, if you feel like your wallet has too much in it, go test drive an EV. You will find yourself saying, holy smokes, is this fun to drive?
Yeah.
It may have the same effect on you that it had on me. I didn't buy an EV because I had access to a tax credit. It was because it was just really fun. And yes, I care about the environment, dismissing that. But we're seeing that market uptake of these vehicles.
I figured I had to walk the talk. And
yes,
given
exactly.
what we do at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, I darn well needed to drive an EV.
Yes. But there's a market pull that's happening there. There is also within that market pull the practical reality that it tends to skew towards people who are wealthier, tends to skew towards people who are whiter, and it tends to skew towards people who own their own home with an attached garage, because then you can put the charger in there. And it's unfortunate, but it's worth noting that when in Build Back Better, we had provisions to massively increase the deployment of chargers, with the focus both on incentives for chargers in people's homes, money for chargers on highways, and money for chargers in urban areas where you have higher rental populations, fewer garages. Like, you just need the infrastructure for how to do that. And in the infrastructure bill, so not the IRA, but the infrastructure bill, we were able to get a significant amount of money for chargers on highways. And it's telling that was the bipartisan part. We could not, on a bipartisan basis, get support for the charging infrastructure in the cities and urban areas. We were able to correct some of that in the IRA, but we didn't get it all done. And a part of that is, Senator Manchin limited what we could do. But so I think we've now got a scenario where we've got, I think the president said in his speech, federal money for 500,000 chargers or so, which is a big deal. Relative to the number of gas stations in America, it's not a lot, but I think it will accelerate that market pull. And what we haven't done, because there was no way to do it, I think that we felt that was honest, but we know it's true, is when you hear those numbers saying that the IRA is going to reduce CO2 emissions to 40% below 2005 levels by 2030. You've heard that number. That's based only on what would happen if we deploy the federal dollars associated with the IRA. What we know is that if your community now has, I don't know, Howard, if you had 20 new charging stations in the town you live in, I think you can
Chicago,
yeah, well, your neighborhood. I think you
my
can
neighbor. We'll
reasonably
use the
assume,
48th ward.
sure. I think you can reasonably assume that that would lead to more people buying electric vehicles, which would create pressure just outside the 48th ward for someone from the private sector to say, geez, I can now make money off doing this. So we know there's going to be a bunch of leverage of private sector dollars, but we haven't really captured that. So I think at this point, we're kind of counting on the federal dollars being the catalyst. And I think are confident that it will catalyze a lot more, but we still need to kind of make sure that what that catalyzes on the more side has some equity to it. The last thing that I just want to say, and this is a small dollars, this was $6 million that I got in the $5 trillion spending package last year. You can send me a thank you card for that if you want. Tiny little number. But what we did is we repurposed $6 million of existing DOE funds to direct the Department of Energy to do an assessment of the entire US power grid and figure out where is our system going to be bottlenecked because of the deployment of electric vehicle chargers, so we can identify and get out in front of that. And to give you a little bit of a sense of how important that is, next time you go, for those of you heathens still driving gasoline powered vehicles, next time you go to a gas station, if the owner's there, ask him what his peak electric load is on his grid. Typical gas station with 8 or 9 pumps outside has a transformer capacity typically of 300 to 400 kilowatts. Doesn't need a lot of electricity to run the pumps and those fine hot dog ovens. But that's one supercharger, maybe 2 superchargers. And so we know at the individual gas station level that they're going to need to have an expansion. But if that gas station wanted to make that expansion today and they went to their utility would probably reasonably say, well, I can't burden all the rest of the ratepayers with this. So in addition to the couple $100,000 you might be willing to spend on a charger, you're going to have to pay another couple $100,000 to upgrade the system in this neighborhood, which may put the deal out of reach. And so what we wanted to do in this study that the DOE is now starting down is to say, let's identify those areas so that our friends in the utility sector can then go to the utility commission and say, okay, we need to bolster this part of the system. We've got the Department of Energy has said this is an important site. Let's include this in our long-term resource plan so that we can start bolstering and preparing for that demand that we know is coming.
That's exactly it. Location. The advantage, as you're putting it, of where we have service stations on the highways is there's real estate there. I mean, there's a place cars have easy access to, trucks have easy access to truck stops. So I agree with you completely. If you get the location right with the utilities working with the public service commissions, we begin to utilize the existing spaces we have. And that makes it easier for people to transition in the sort of the chicken and egg. If I get an EV, do I feel comfortable I'm going to be able with my driving patterns to get a charge pretty easily? Because all the data, all the market data, as you know, is that that's the number one impediment. Number one is range anxiety. Number 2 is price, and hopefully the price is coming down some.
Yeah, although I will say that what's interesting is you asking people why they aren't buying an EV who don't own one is sort of like asking people why they don't buy a second home in the Caribbean if they don't already have one. It's an entirely theoretical question. And what I've found personally, and I think a lot of the anecdotal data I've seen, is that people who have EVs are very quick to buy second EVs because they realize that their theory of how they drive is actually, quite different from saying, well, now you just top it up in your garage all the time.
Well, that's right.
I think some of I don't want to predict the future, but I am confident in saying that in a world with 60-70% EV penetration, we will be charging in places that are quite different from where we're filling our cars right now, because the way that you drive starts to change and the dynamics move around. And we need to be.
I agree with you. The transition point is when we get to that point. I completely agree with you. In the short run, there's sort of a degree of comfort of, will I be able to charge at the places I'm familiar with?
Yeah. No,
and that's also why fleets are so darn important, because lots of heavy trucks going to truck stops, lots of CTA buses in Chicago going to bus garages. if we can begin to electrify the fleets, as folks like Amazon are doing. And
I actually had a really interesting conversation with one of the major truck manufacturers who was very bullish on long haul trucking going electric much quicker than we think. And their thesis, which is interesting to think about, is they said because you would think that would be the hardest part of the transportation sector to, get off of the flexibility of a liquid fuel. And they said, basically, we're getting to a point where the batteries are starting to be cheap enough and the superchargers are fast enough that the downtime to charge is starting to map very closely to the required driver downtime of a long haul truck. And so it at that point simply becomes a question of what's the lower, long-term operating cost of the vehicle. And it's an interesting theory, but to the point about it starts to change the way you think about things, right? What does a truck stop start to look like when you're sitting there saying, I can go 500 miles on a charge. Every 500 miles, I got to take whatever the laws are, hour, 2 hours off. I can be fully recharged in 30 minutes, right? Like it starts to change the dynamics, right?
Exactly. You're right. Hey, we have just a couple more minutes. I know you want to say something a little bit on energy efficiency and some of the now federal incentives there are for efficiency, the best, the fastest, the cheapest climate solution. To talk a little bit about efficiency, and let's figure out anything else you want to really focus on for a minute.
Let me maybe use this to tease an idea that I've been working through that I don't really have totally down on paper yet. I think we are in the process of a transition in U.S. energy policy that we're only just starting to get our head around, which is a transition not to energy efficiency, but to energy productivity. We, as an economy, every week or every month at least, I can go on, government data and I can see what's happening to U.S. labor productivity by sector, by state, by region, how we compare to our competitors. And folks will be appropriately scrutinizing those numbers and will shift their investments to people who are not as labor productive as others, or question what United States, workforce and education policy if we don't have a productive workforce relative to our competitors. Similar deal on capital, right? If you're an investor, you want to know what the company you invest in is earning as a return on their invested capital, and are they prioritizing those resources? Well, it only takes three things to run an economy: capital, labor, and energy. And we never, ever actually even tried to track our energy productivity. And as best as we can, as best as I've been able to figure from existing data, the United States generates about $200 of GDP per million BTU of primary energy. Because of the ways we track things, I think it's probably much lower than that. But based on the existing data, that's where we are. That is a half the productivity of the UK. It's a third the productivity of Switzerland. And if I told you that we were, only getting a third of the productivity of our labor force as Switzerland, we would be having a come to Jesus moment. What is wrong with the American worker, right? And why do we squander so much energy? If we could actually get to Swiss levels of energy productivity, which is sort of, but not kind of, the same thing as energy efficiency, we could triple our economy without using a single additional BTU of primary energy. That is insane, right? Like it boggles the mind that you could do that. And when I asked some of my European colleagues whether they agreed with that analysis and what they thought might be the thing that they're doing that's different, they was talking to this British guy in Glasgow, and he just laughed and he said, "Oh, it's real easy." He said, "You guys and us and the French, we all came up with democracy at the same time. It was the same cast of characters. It was Locke and Franklin and Jefferson. But in our case, the people had spread out all over the land, and we had to figure out how to equitably use the resources that we had in a democratic system. In your case, you'd killed the natives, and you designed a pressure relief valve to incentivize resource extraction through the Homestead Act, through other stuff." And so he said, our view as Europeans, a view in America, is that you built your economy by incentivizing resource use, and you are now only just starting to the point of having to transition to what we've been doing for the last 200 years to actually get the most out of every unit you use. And I think there's that's a real pregnant idea, right? But what would it mean for us to actually rethink our economy, rethink our energy infrastructure to get the most out of every BTU? In the same way we want to get the most out of every capital dollar and the most out of every hour of labor. And we got some ideas, but take this as a teaser for things that we're going to be working on over the next year or two.
Well, that is a big idea. That's an important idea. And both connecting to how do you squeeze the most value out of BTUs, and how do we be, we leave so much energy efficiency, just simply on the floor. I mean, it's low hanging fruit and we don't even pick it up. The fact of the matter is best, fast, cheapest solution. I think what you and your colleagues did on the IRA is really good in terms of providing a little boost for energy efficiency appliances, and that technology keeps getting better and people install more efficient refrigerators in their homes and more efficient lights and so forth. That lightens the load on the grid, reduces pollution, saves people money. And hopefully that's one that when we get past a little bit of the partisanship in Congress, that when it comes to saving people money on their electricity and gas bills, that's one that across the aisle you can get some more support.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your joining us today. You should have the last word. Tell us what's coming next. What do you want to leave people with, Congressman? We all greatly respect what you're doing to address and lead on addressing the climate crisis.
Well, as you know, the respect is mutual and probably flows strong in the other direction. We're fortunate to have
Thank you,
Howard and ELPC for all that you do. I think my biggest admonition to you all is, I was speaking to a bunch of financial types this morning about sort of what the challenges are in this transition. And I said, one of the biggest challenges is that most people who have titles that suggest that they are in positions of leadership are deeply uncomfortable leading. And that the test of leadership is not whether you stand up, it's when you stand up. And so we are now at a moment where we've filled a really big federal engine here with a lot of incentives, a lot of money that's coming down the pike. It is going to massively transform every part of our society. And the speed at which it makes that transformation is going to be paced only by the speed with which we as Americans, I don't care what party you are, we as Americans stand up and say, let's go get this done to leave a cleaner, cheaper, more resilient, more robust world for our kids. And so for the folks on this call, thank you for the leadership you've shown, and keep going.
And thank you, Congressman Sean Casten, for what you've done, what you're going to be doing, and more fundamentally, really your leadership. You're walking the talk. Take care, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. It will be posted on Facebook. You can see it and do a replay or share it with your friends. And our thanks again to Congressman Sean Casten, Illinois 6th Congressional District. Take care.
Thanks so much.